Every time you explain yourself, you're giving away power without even realizing it. Not because you're wrong, not because you're weak, but because you're speaking like someone seeking forgiveness, not someone who commands. You may not see it, but the moment you start justifying your choices, you've already stepped down from the throne. You're no longer the one making decisions, you're the one asking for permission to make them. Machiavelli understood this better than anyone. He didn't write to help you be liked. He wrote so you could survive, so you could dominate without apology. I used to think like you. I believed that if I was honest, people would trust me. That if I explained myself clearly, they'd stand with me. But the more I explained, the more they dissected. What I thought was connection, they saw a strategy. What I believed was trust became a manual on how to break me. I handed them the blueprint, and they turned it into a weapon. Words aren't always connection. Sometimes, they are slow self-destruction. You think you're leading, but really, you're pleading to be understood. Here's the truth. You don't need to be understood. You need to be felt. You need to walk into a room and shift the atmosphere without saying a word. Not because you're performing power, but because you've stopped performing entirely. Let them guess. Let them worry. Let them sit in silence, waiting for a voice that never arrives. The most powerful person in the room isn't the one who speaks the most. It's the one who makes people hold their breath, waiting for a sentence. If you've ever lost yourself trying to justify who you are, if you've ever explained your worth only to be ignored, now is the time to stop. No more defending, no more apologizing. From this moment on, let silence become your language. Let presence be your declaration. When you try to explain yourself, you hand your enemy the blueprint. It doesn't feel like weakness. It feels noble, honest, human. You explain to build trust, to show transparency, to be real. But every word becomes a foothold, a clue, a crack in your armor they didn't earn but now possess. I learned that the hard way. In meetings, I spoke with clarity. In relationships, I offered reasons. In doubt, I opened up. And I bled for it. Because no one preserves what you reveal. They analyze it. They interpret it. They weaponize it. The more I spoke, the more predictable I became. The more I shared, the easier I was to dismantle. They didn't respect my honesty. They studied it. They mapped it, and they moved accordingly. Machiavelli warned us. He who reveals himself is no longer feared, only analyzed and eventually replaced. You don't need to be understood. You need to be effective. You need to be felt without being dissected. The less they know about your next move, the more they fear it. Let that sink in. Because in this game, fear isn't built on facts. It's built on uncertainty, on ambiguity, on the unnerving truth that you might do anything, and they have no way of predicting what you want. Control? You don't get it by explaining. You get it by disappearing behind the veil of silence and letting their imaginations do the work for you. When people can't read you, they start creating stories about you. And those stories are always more extreme than the reality. They begin whispering, speculating, projecting their fears onto your stillness. And suddenly, you become bigger than life, not because you spoke louder, but because you stopped speaking entirely. You may not notice it at first. It starts small, one sentence here, a quick clarification there. You think you're being reasonable, transparent. You think you're building bridges, but you're not. You're handing out weapons. Each explanation is a chisel, and the more you speak, the more they carve away at the stone of your authority. Machiavelli warned. He who opens himself up for examination and vitriol in the court of power. There are no fair judges. There are only opportunists, spectators, enemies wearing smiles, friends who haven't yet chosen sides. You give them a reason, they turn it into a condition. You give them context, they question your competence. Because once you explain yourself, you are no longer commanding. You are requesting. There's a level of power that doesn't just speak less, it refuses to explain. Not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. Because men who move history forward don't beg for alignment, they act. They shift the board, and the world adjusts. You can see it in their posture, no panic, no rush to be liked, no need to be understood, only present. Only gravity. Explanations are cheap. Consequences are currency. Once they've mapped your steps, they stop watching. Once they understand your rhythm, they stop reacting. And when they stop reacting, you've already lost control. Familiarity doesn't build respect. It breeds complacency, and complacency is the death of influence. True power lives in mystery, in shadows, in the unanswered questions. Ready to stop explaining and start commanding? Subscribe to Virtù and join the journey of mastering silence, strategy, and real control. Let your presence speak louder than your words.